Good day to each of you joining us from Jerusalem. I'm Father John Paul of the Tantur Ecumenical Institute. Thank you for joining us for this second part of our series From Easter to Pentecost, presented to you in partnership with the Ignatian Spirituality Center and the Ignatian Spirituality Community, both out of Geneva and Glasgow. I'm here in Jerusalem with Mr. Nizar Haloun, our program director, Sister Marie Feruza, our program coordinator, and also with us, our presenter today, Marcie Lenk and Stephanie Scaldana. Introducing more information about today's presentation and the presenters, Nizar, go ahead.
Thank you, Father John Paul. Welcome to the second session of this 2022 Easter to Pentecost series. Today, the lecture will be presented by Dr. Marcie Lenk, and the spiritual reflection that will follow will be given by Stephanie Scaldana. So in this session, Dr. Marcie will be talking about the presence of the women at the tomb in the dynamic of Jesus' death and resurrection. Marcie received her PhD at Harvard with a dissertation entitled The Apostolic Constitutions, Judaism and Anti-Judaism in the Construction of Christianity. Marcie has devoted her intellectual life and career to organizing educational programs and teaching Jews and Christians and people of other faiths to understand and appreciate the basic texts, ideas, history, and faith of the other. Stephanie Scaldana received a bachelor's degree from the Middlebury College and a master's degree in theological studies from Harvard Divinity School, with a focus on Muslim-Christian dialogue. She's a writer, journalist, and researcher currently working on a project called Mosaic Stories, which aims to collect and protect intangible cultural heritage in the Middle East through research, storytelling, and education. The lecture will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A session, another 15 minutes of spiritual reflection given by Stephanie, and 10 minutes of spiritual sharing of the participants. So don't hesitate to send me your questions over the chat throughout the talk. And for the last segment, please click your raise your hand button so we can unmute you and be able to share. And now, Marcie, over to you.
Thank you, Nizar. And thank you all for joining together on Zoom today. It's really quite an honor to be with you, to be a part of the Tantur team, and to present on this topic. Let me just share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Okay. Actually, before we, one second, how do I get to the previous? Okay. Okay, before we start with the text, let me give you a sense of where I hope we'll get to today. What we'll do is actually read the story of the women at the tomb in all four canonical Gospels. I hope that it won't feel repetitive. I don't think it will, because there really are striking differences in the tellings in each of the Gospels. And what I hope we'll be able to do is notice what is in each of the Gospels, what's different about them, what we can learn about how the story is told. And I think particularly for a group like this, what that means to us. Let's get started. I'm beginning with Mark's Gospel, and that's because it's the shortest. And the story, this story is also the shortest. It's the shortest version of the women's story as well. And I think the other Gospels in some way build on Mark's version. So when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. First of all, we have 3 women who are named here, right? 2 Marys and Salome. We don't know that much about all of them, right? But we do have this group of women. It certainly is significant that they are named, right? It means that somebody at some point knew more about them. We can even put it that way, right? But that the names are significant, that the memory that these women were there, that these women in particular, not just women, but these women were there. And that Mark also thought that naming these women was, that was important. Now, at this point in the story, of course, no one else is there. Everyone has left, right? One could argue that everyone has deserted Jesus. I mean, he's died, right, and been buried. So perhaps one could argue there's nothing more to stay for, right? But it is interesting to note that these women felt that there was something to stay for or to show up again for. We do know that in the Gospel of Mark, as in other Gospels, there are descriptions of women as well as men who were following Jesus, women who were serving Jesus and the disciples. And even the word serving, right, is the same word as deacon, right? They were deaconing, one could argue, right? They were providing service. So in some way, women were disciples all along. They were disciples of Jesus, but in the Gospel of Mark, most of the stories, almost all of the stories of discipleship itself, where discipleship is being described, they are stories about men disciples. So on the one hand, you sort of have these women there, but they really show up and are named here in this story. And one could argue that these women have been there all along, right? They've been faithful and they haven't left. As they entered the tomb, I just need to move this a second. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They fear is a striking element here, right? They are afraid, right? The young man says to them, the angel says to them, "Do not be afraid," but in the end, they are afraid. And some interpreters have looked at this particular issue of their fear and said, well, they shouldn't have been, right? They were told by the angel not to be afraid, and they failed, right? They didn't go and tell the disciples. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so this is a story of failure. But perhaps we can understand their fear, right? This is, anyway, going into perhaps a burial tomb is a little bit frightening, right? The fact that the stone has been moved could also cause fear. It must have been somebody strong. This is a group of women alone. Who knows what kind of men are there, what kind of threats there could be to them there. And then when they see that Jesus's body isn't there, well, who wouldn't be afraid? Who's ever seen such a thing? So of course they were afraid. On the other hand, they failed, right? They didn't fulfill their mission, right? They were called by this angel to be, one could argue, the first apostles, right? The first messengers to tell the disciples. And interestingly, Peter, who had already just previously denied knowing Jesus, right? But Peter is singled out here. But they didn't do it. So it's true that they failed, right? They were supposed to go and tell, and they did not. On the other hand, perhaps it's arguable that they're no worse than any of the male disciples who weren't there at all. Right? Now, we know that if you open up your Gospel of Mark, you'll see that there are other endings. This is the short ending, and there are longer endings. There are other traditions of what happened next. But many scholars, most scholars that I'm aware of, have argued that this shorter ending was probably the original ending in Mark, that other copyists might have expanded a little bit more, because how could you end with them not telling anyone, right? Then how would anyone know, right? Of course, the answer is, well, the reader knows. We know, right? They were afraid and they didn't tell, but somehow the word got out anyway, right? And Mark knew, he told the story, right? And now any readers know. So the reader is now deputized to tell the story of the empty tomb and of Jesus's resurrection, right? Even if the women didn't at that point. But that's the ending, at least the short ending in Mark. Let's go on. Matthew tells the story a little bit differently. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Okay, so we have two Marys, right? And that's all, two women in this version. It is interesting to note that all four versions have Mary Magdalene. She's always in the story. She's the only constant of the women, interestingly enough. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. So again, we have these women, right, who went to see, right, to see the tomb, right? And interestingly, the guards, right, who should have been strong, brave men, right, they're the ones who are afraid, right? They shook and became like dead men. They're useless, right? But as we'll see, the women have a different response. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell the disciples, he has been raised from the dead, and indeed, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. So here too, we encounter their fear, right? From the fact that the angel says to the women, "Do not be afraid," we might intuit that they were afraid. And indeed, at the end of this section, right, they left the tomb with fear, but they also left with great joy, and they ran to tell the disciples, right? So they show, again, not only their loyalty by being there, but their faith in overcoming their fear, in feeling their joy, and in going to deliver the message. Suddenly, Jesus met them and said, "Hail." I just want to say something about the word. The Greek here is cherete, which is the same word, interestingly, that's used by Judas in his betrayal in chapter 26. It's also the same word that was used by the Roman soldiers who mocked Jesus in chapter 27 in Matthew. And this is the first word that Jesus speaks to the women, right? So in a certain sense, maybe it's ironic, but it's also overcoming the betrayal, the mocking, right? That word that was used to mock Jesus, to capture Jesus and to mock Jesus, Jesus uses that word now in order to greet the women, right? And show himself to them. And of course, and Jesus said to them, right, "Do not be afraid, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." Right, so the women came to see, and their message is to tell the brothers, right, the male disciples, that they are going to see the risen Christ. And of course, the women are being told directly by Jesus to be the messengers, right? To be, again, the Greek word is apostle. Now, I skipped a few verses here. Okay, the next verses are about what other people, the guards, some of the opponents of Jesus thought when they saw the empty tomb. But that's not important for our purposes, I think, today. So I want to just skip those verses and move on to what happens next. Now, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. Now, why did they go there? Right? How did they know to go there? They knew that from the women, right? Because the women told them, presumably. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age." Now the Great Commission that Jesus gives to the 11, right, male disciples, right, is different from the commission or the mission that Jesus had given to the women. So there's still, one could argue, a distinction in Matthew between the roles of the women and the roles of the men. Nonetheless, it is striking to notice that where the version in Mark ended with the women's fear, right? In Matthew's gospel, the women actually, with great joy, go out after they've seen, they are the first to see the risen Christ. They go out and fulfill their mission. Let's take a look at the Gospel of Luke. Okay. When all the crowds who had gathered there for the spectacle, this is the crucifixion, saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. Right? Most people saw what they saw and went home. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. Right? So we have the women again, right, holding on, right, being steadfast, staying there. And here I want to notice that particularly in the Gospel of Luke, here the women aren't named at the tomb, but earlier in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 8, when Jesus was going through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God, the 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chuza, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their resources. And it's actually quite striking that Luke, among the 4 Gospels, has more stories about women in his Gospel than the others do. And the women seem to always be there. There seem to be a large number, for example, of these wealthy women who provided for not only Jesus but but all of the disciples out of their resources. Right? They had resources from which to provide, and they were there. So presumably, some of these women are the women who Luke is pointing to who are at the tomb. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. Okay, so first of all, there's no mention of fear here, right? There is confusion because it's strange, right? Where could the body have gone? Another difference, and I'm not sure what to make of the difference, but Luke has 2 men rather than 1, right? 2 angels. Anyway, but here we have now the women were terrified now, right? Because they see angels. And here we should keep in mind, of course, that in Hebrew scripture, in the Old Testament, when a person saw an angel, a messenger of God, they were afraid, right? For fear that they were getting too close to God, right? God said to Moses, no one can see me and live, right? When Moses asks to see God, right? And Moses ends up seeing the back of God, whatever that means, right? But not God's face. So to see God or to see an angel is a fearful thing, and the women are afraid when they see these angels, which seems fitting. And they bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again?" And I'm struck by the fact that these angels say to the women, "Don't you remember what he told you?" Right? The emphasis here is on the fact that they were there. they're expected to remember because they were part of Jesus's disciples, right? And so he reminds them of this. Then they remembered his words, right? Indeed, right? They do remember. And returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and to all the rest, right? They understand intuitively what to do. And now we have names. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. So notice we have a number of named women, but then we have and the other women who were with them. So it's more than three. It's more than 2 women, it's more than 3 women. There's a whole group of women who go together to tell the apostles that Jesus has risen, right? And the response that they get is, but these words seem to them, I mean to the male disciples, as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And that idea of it being an idle tale, right? It's the kinds of stories that women tell. That's what I hear when I hear that reaction, right? They didn't believe them because they were women. But of course, Luke wants us to know, as do the other gospel writers, right? That the women were right. The women were telling the truth. The fact that the men didn't believe them was terrible, right? But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Okay, so at least Peter gave it a chance, right? He goes stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves. But what happens next? Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. I don't know what to make of that, right? He's amazed. He knows something happened, right? But it seems that he doesn't completely understand it, right? And that perhaps the women understand it even better. One more. Gospel of John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So now we only have Mary Magdalene by herself. And what does she do? So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went towards the tomb. The 2 were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. Okay, so this story, this version actually comes in a few parts, right? We have Mary Magdalene who sees something, right? She sees that the stone has been removed, right? But she doesn't presumably know yet what it all means. And she goes to tell the disciples, right? And they come to see, they saw, they believed, but they also don't completely understand yet what happened. They return to their homes, yes, but what about Mary Magdalene? But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. Now I want to point out that the men, right, Peter right? And the other disciple, the beloved disciple, presumably, they also looked into the tomb, right? They saw what they saw. Mary sees something else, right? She bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to him, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she said this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Right? So Mary has quite an experience here, and she's weeping, right? Of course she's weeping, right? Because she wanted to serve Jesus even after his death, right? And take care of the body, show respect and honor for the body, and it's gone. And here too, when she sees Jesus and she mistakes him for the gardener, right? Here too, one could say, "Oh, silly Mary, how could you have thought he was the gardener?" But come on, what should she have thought? Nobody had ever seen such a thing before. So how could she have possibly known? And when he speaks to her, excuse me, when he speaks to her here, he calls her by name, Mary. And she recognizes him as her teacher. If he is her teacher, she is his student, his disciple. In other words, John has no problem with naming, showing Mary as a messenger, as the first to receive this revelation, as a person of intense faith, and in that faith, faithfully bringing the message, not only of the empty tomb, but of the meaning of the resurrection to the other disciples. Let me go out. Yeah. Now I can see you, or some of you anyway. So I hope that that you feel, as I do, that in going through the different versions of the story, we can appreciate even more. First of all, on the one hand, how much some of the storytellers might have wanted to push the women to the side. It seems that in this story they couldn't, even if they wanted to, because the story of at least Mary Magdalene being there, right, at the empty tomb, at least, if not the first witness to the risen Christ. The story was too well known, and they couldn't leave it out completely. But as we read in the different Gospels, we get a different sense of how they told that story, what they thought the roles of these women actually were. Should these women be seen as fearful? Should they be seen as mistaken, as idly chattering, right? Or should they be seen as the most faithful of the disciples, right? As apostles themselves. So I'll stop here. And if you have questions, comments, reactions, I would love to hear.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcie, for taking the time to go through different passages of the gospel and explaining the different angles of these very valuable sentences. So I had a question, but actually came also through one of the participants. Lourdes is asking, it has always struck me that Jesus appeared first to the women. Is there a significance to this phenomena? I would have expected that Jesus would appear to his apostles, Peter in particular. I wonder why.
I don't know if I can answer the why. I agree with your question. It is striking to note that it depends which gospel you read, right? Whether Jesus appeared first to the women or first to the men, right? Here it depends on the gospel, but for those gospels where particularly I would say in Luke and John, and somewhat in Matthew, but more in Luke and John, I think. There is a little bit of a criticism of the other disciples, including Peter, and this shouldn't surprise us because Peter is criticized throughout the Gospels. I mean, it takes him a while to get it right, and maybe that's okay, right? It takes most of us a while to get things right. So I say this not out of disrespect for Peter, but to notice, right, that there is this critique of the others, of those who weren't able to be brave enough to see this new thing and know what to do with it. Perhaps, it was, the one thing that I can say about the appearance, particularly to the women, is to think about the women as outsiders to some extent, even if they were there all along, right? We saw that, in many of the Gospels. Even if they were there is no doubt that in their time, and unfortunately, to some extent, even in the 21st century, women are sometimes seen as sort of extra bodies, right? Not the main event, right? The main recipients of the teachings, right? The main people who were there are presumed to be the men. And so the women, perhaps because they saw themselves, they were treated as outsiders, they saw themselves as outsiders, they didn't have to follow the same rules as the men, right? They weren't expected to do what the men did. And while that is often experienced negatively, and I can say in my own experience of being pushed out sometimes, it's not a good feeling. You can also build certain abilities because you're not in the center group. And so there's something that stands out about these women. The women are able to be steadfast in a way that perhaps the men weren't, at least not right away.
So do you think, that's my question, do you think that there is a kind of a role for women in this particular passage that is more important than in the other passages of the gospel for women specifically, meaning that women here play a much bigger role than in any other passages in the gospels.
Yeah. I mean, what strikes me, what moves me about it is, and as I pointed to, especially in the Gospel of John, you see it, this idea of women as apostles, right? It's shocking perhaps to say if you're from a sort of traditional church, right? And I understand that. But if we think of apostle in its Greek meaning as messenger, there is no doubt that that is Mary Magdalene's role here, right? She's not a repentant prostitute, right? She's not like a shocking one. She's simply a disciple, a faithful disciple, and a faithful messenger. And I know that some women in some churches, or maybe some women just in their private devotions have seen in this story and stories like it models, right, that maybe society doesn't always, or even churches don't always allow women into certain roles, but Jesus did, right? And now what that means, it's not my role to, to say what should happen in particular denominations and churches and women's roles and all of that. That's, I'm an outsider to that. So it's not my role to say that, but there is something to be said. I think the women here are not only in women's roles, right? This isn't just, it's true that perhaps bringing the spices, right, to honor the buried Jesus, right? Maybe that was the role of some women, right? To bring spices and, to cemeteries, right? Or to burial tombs. Perhaps that's true, but in the end, what these women do is much more than that.
So Stefan is asking, do you think that they might have felt they would be in danger for showing that they were associated with Jesus?
Well, it's clear that the men did, right? The men were afraid of that. And what's striking here is that these women weren't. Maybe other women were, but here I go back to Luke's version of the story where he says there were lots of women who were there, right? It wasn't only Mary Magdalene, it wasn't only these named women, but there were a lot of them, right? So if that was a reason to be afraid, and it seems that it was, these women, they were okay with it. Like they said, it's worth the risk. We're going to stay. And that's amazing too.
Yeah. So, but I'm still wondering why did it have to be so discreet? Because it should have been a major event, right? We're talking about the resurrection. You would think that it would have happened like to a big crowd and kind of a big event. Why did it have to go to be that discreet though?
Well, that's a question to ask Jesus. Why did Jesus do it that way? But what I thought, the direction I thought you were going actually is, if we look back at Mark's version, right, where they all run away and they're afraid, right, and they don't tell the short ending in Mark. We should remember that in the Gospel of Mark, and we see this in some of the other Gospels also, during Jesus's life, when he performed miracles, he often says to the disciples, don't tell anyone, right? Don't tell anyone. And inevitably they tell, right? Or the person who's healed is told not to tell, but then that person goes out and tells, right? So there's this secret that keeps being revealed. And it is ironic right, that at the end, there's something that's meant to be told and it isn't told in Mark, right? But it is told in the other Gospels, right? It is told there. And as I suggested, at least the Gospel of Mark tells, right? We all know because the Gospel tells us, right? So the story is told, right? But there is that tension between, is this meant to be a secret and therefore revealed secretly, maybe? It's not ready to be told, to something that's told in public. But it seems that even in all the versions, the first telling, right, is to the disciples, right, and then to others. So perhaps people had to figure out what their words would be to tell the story. How do you describe something that can't be described with normal human language? So perhaps that would take time, but I don't know. I think that's a very interesting question, actually.
Another question, the women were taking spices to prepare the body. Was this a typical women's role, or do men participate in this as well?
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I mean, it sounds from the way that the Gospels tell the story that this was something that women would do, but you could suggest that it's something that anybody would do. It's just in this particular case, only women were prepared to do it. So I'm not sure about that. I mean, presumably the idea of taking the spices is, you know, if you think about it in realistic terms, as the body decomposes, it might feel dishonorable, right? The same reason that many funerals, you know, traditionally one brings lots of flowers, right, to a funeral, right, is to cover the smell of a decomposing body, right? But it's a way of showing respect. You don't want it to smell bad, because then what do you think of, right? It would lead to more sort of negative, base thoughts, right? But if it smells better, right, then you can think about the person when he was alive, right? It feels different, right? So that's how I understand the bringing of the spices to the tomb, right? That's what they intend. They assumed that there was a body there, that they were bringing the spices.
Yeah. So the women, despite not understanding at first, were witness to the most important event of our faith. Why has the story of the church not made greater efforts to understand and underline their role and to build responses to the current challenges of the church as those posed by the synod?
I don't know. Again, you know, as an sort of outsider, you know, I don't know, but I would say, I would give two answers. First of all, there are lots of people, men and women, who do know, right? Who have read these stories, and you know, and there are many icons and illustrations that emphasize the roles of the women. So there are people who do know. There's poetry that's been written. There are reflections that have been composed, imagining what these women felt. Actually, a close friend of mine who's a Methodist pastor in the United States was recently telling me that she gave a sermon about this story and she did a sort of reflection, imagining that she was one of these women who had just experienced it. And she talked about her feelings, the fear that she felt, the shock, the amazement, right? She went through those stages. So there are people who do know. At the same time, I think there is sometimes an attempt to minimize the roles, the public roles at least, of women, and women as witnesses, the first witnesses, women as apostles. This could be threatening to men who want to exclusively hold on to that power. And so that's there too, okay? But all I can say is these are your stories. You know, they're yours for you to have, to hold, to work with.
I don't know if Stephanie wants to maybe give her take about this question, since I know she's following the synod as a Khouria, the wife of a priest in Bethlehem. Would you like to give your take, Stephanie?
Wow, I wasn't expecting that question, but I think that it's, as you said, there are stories, and we have a role and a place to tell them and reframe them. And I know, for example, after Easter, a lot of women were angry at the Easter homilies that had no mention of the women. But I think now increasingly we talk about that, and we talk about it more. And I think we're in a moment where we're trying to claim the space that has always been ours. You know, it's not that it's ours now; it's always been ours. You know, that has always been our space, even if it hasn't been recognized. That's what I think.
Thank you. One more question. So how significant is it that the women were apostles to the disciples, whereas the disciples in Galilee were set to the world?
So here I would say, you know, the story happens in history, right? In the real world. You know, it doesn't happen in an imaginary world. And the real world of the first century, and perhaps arguably into the 21st century, but certainly in the first century, was quite patriarchal. And so it's not surprising that this was the role, the recognized sort of male role. That being said, there were stories that continued to be told in the early church about women's roles. For example, in the Acts of Paul, otherwise sometimes known as the Acts of Paul and Thecla, you have a woman named Thecla who is determined to spread the gospel. And she goes through all kinds of adventures and turmoil, and she's almost killed a number of times. It's an amazing story. If you don't know it, you should read it. But in the end, in order for her to follow Paul, which she is determined to do, she wants to, you know, spread the gospel like Paul is doing. She actually dresses like a man, because otherwise she'll be abused. Okay, because she's been attacked because she's so beautiful. And she says, I don't want to be attacked, but I want to go out into the world and do this thing. So she dresses like a man in order to go along as an apostle, essentially. So you have that story, the story of Thecla. You have many, many, many stories about Mary Magdalene as the favorite, beloved disciple of Jesus. We know the Da Vinci Code version that Mary Magdalene was the lover of Jesus, but I don't like that version, I have to say, so much, because that makes Mary Magdalene important because she had a female body, like because she was a sexual being. I mean, it's fine to be sexual. I have nothing against bodies, but But I think that what's most interesting in some of these early Christian tellings is that Jesus has many post-resurrection dialogues with Mary Magdalene because she understands him in a way that some of the other disciples, including Peter, don't. Okay, this is not a 20th century or 21st century story. These are stories that were being told in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, in the 4th century. They're ancient texts that saved it. So I really appreciate what Stephanie said before, that these were always there. They were always your stories, right? And it's clear that people, men and women, embraced these versions of having women in such roles, but those weren't deemed to be, perhaps the word that I would use is orthodox, with a lowercase o, right? But these were sort of pushed aside a little bit in the tradition as male men's roles and women's roles were clearly distinguished societally. But again, these are resources that are there. They are part of they're there in the tradition, even if sometimes they got pushed aside.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marcie, for this mysterious and intriguing session about the women at the tomb. Thank you very much. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Let's see. There we go. Did that work?
Mm-hmm. Yes, works.
I'm working on multiple devices here. There we go. Okay. It's such a joy to come after Marcie. I always learn so much when she opens up the biblical text for me, and I see things I've never noticed before. Today, I'm going to just bring you back to the first reading that she did from the Gospel of Mark. And I'll just take you through a brief meditation to spend some more time thinking about it. But before I start, I'll just help us to transition a little bit into this prayer session. So I'll just ask you to take a few moments to become silent. Maybe put your feet on the ground if you're sitting in a chair, and straighten your back. And relax your shoulders. If your hands are closed, maybe open them and feel your fingers a bit. And just take a deep breath and center yourself into the room again. If there's any thoughts that are distracting you, just notice them and put them aside for later. And just center again on your breath. And just try to bring the entirety of yourself back into the room where you are. Back to your breath and centered. And I'm going to read again the Gospel of Mark. And you can close your eyes if you'd like and just listen. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. He said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Let us begin with just the first lines. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. As Marcie noted, everyone else had left, maybe even abandoning Jesus. But these women remained faithful. They went to the tomb. They took a risk. Lately, I've been reflecting on those few lines. They went to the tomb. All of us have experienced deeply painful events in our own lives. Many of us have lived through trauma so deep that we would rather just look away. Or we're aware of painful realities in the society that seem so difficult that we just don't want to think about them. We can become so habituated to the story of Jesus's crucifixion that we can forget how awful, how frightening, how scary it must have been for those who loved him the most. Their beloved friend and teacher was arrested. He was executed in public. Some of the women had watched this from a distance. Peter was questioned and denied knowing him. To have lived through such a thing is hard to imagine. It's scary, it's overwhelming. Yet here is the story of three women who, only 3 days later, courageously buy spices to anoint the body, and they went to the tomb. So let us take a moment to just sit with that, to pray with that. The image of three women in the early morning: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. In their hands, they carry spices to anoint the body of Jesus. They are not turning away from what has happened. No, they will face it, and they will go to the tomb. To wake up early in the morning, to walk the path, smell the spices they were carrying in their hands, clutching so tightly so as not to drop them, careful not to spill anything. The way they might have squinted to navigate the path in the early morning. Lost, maybe numb, frightened, Practically, to be associated with this executed man might have been a great risk. Still, they carried the spices and walked through the streets. When we feel a sense of uncertainty, the gospel says that they had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us at the entrance to the tomb? Who will roll away the stone at the entrance to the tomb?" In this tiny detail, we're told concretely how much they don't know as they're walking. They want to anoint the body of Jesus, but there will be a heavy stone in the way, and they don't yet know who will roll it away. And it seems that to move it is beyond their capacity. Of course, we hear a deeper question, a question of despair. Jesus is gone. Who will move our stones away? In this question, who will roll the stone away? And their decision to keep walking, even while asking it, we begin to learn what hope is. Not our human hope, but the hope given by God. For they have set out to the tomb with spices, yet they don't know who will roll away the stone. They simply trust. That is the hope they witness for us. The women didn't say, "I will go to the tomb, see if I will find someone who can move the stone, and only then will I buy the spices." No, they bought the spices first, trusting that something would happen, that someone would be there to move the stone away. And indeed, when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. Where does such hope come from? That is a hope given by God. That is a hope that allows us to live our lives in the trust that a way is possible, even if we do not know how it will turn out. And we live already today with that trust. All of us know the largeness of those stones that can come in our path. But yes, the stone had already been rolled back. In the gospel, it says, as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Do not be alarmed, for Jesus has been raised from the dead. So we stand with the women you see here at the entrance. And yes, we are alarmed. And then to calm us, the young man says, "Look, there is the place that they laid him." It's a very human moment in the midst of an incredible story. Look, that's exactly the place where he was. We look. We see that Jesus is no longer in the tomb. He is risen. Yes, we have walked to the tomb, carrying spices in our hands, full of uncertainty. We have arrived to find the stone set aside and the tomb empty. He is no longer there. All of us have heard the phrase that we are called to be Easter people, the people of Easter, it's sometimes said, that we witness the resurrection in our entire being. When we walk with these women, we learn a little bit what that means. when we see the heavy stone pushed aside. It means, first of all, to live in reality, to still confront our difficulties, our challenges, our fears, and every day to go to the tomb, to face what is frightening, what seems impossible. It means to be faithful. It means, even when we don't know how the stone will be pushed aside, to already set out with the spices in our hand. And it means to be afraid. When the young man says, "Do not be alarmed," it's because we all are. God doesn't call people who aren't afraid. The Bible tells us God always calls people who are afraid. We learn that when we trust in God, we can move beyond our fears. We journey with the three women to find that he has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place where they laid him. But go tell with resurrected hearts. Listening to Marcie, we can feel the despair of the women who went away afraid. And yet, reading the text, we know that the angel isn't just speaking to them. The angel is speaking to us today. Go, tell, he says to us. Go and be witnesses. And so we finish with a small prayer. O Lord, you gave the women strength to walk to the tomb. Give us the courage to face our fears, to be faithful to you in all things. Help us to speak to you, to trust in the face of uncertainty, to be witnesses of your resurrection today and always. Amen.
Thank you, Stephanie, for this moment of meditation and for helping us take a break and feel and live that moment again today. We'll now open the mic for everyone who would like to share thoughts about anything that was said today, if you feel like it. You can click on the reactions button below, then again on the raise your hand button so we can unmute you.
I just want to say I have to go to morning prayer, so I have to leave. But I wanted to thank you, Marcie and Stephanie, for both of your reflections. For me, it's that I think that women today, when you look at the role of women in the 20th century, and you look at history, and how long it took for women today to be able to open up in the 20th century, then you see that level of juxtaposition of discretion and what God is doing. And I think today that the role of women are so important. And I think Christ is in all of that. The idea that everything that's all the issues, which is global, is really contained within our planet. And there's something to say about that, about the role of women coming more and more important for the future. And it's taken some time, but I think that today is a moment not only to reflect on all of those things, but also when you do the readings and to come at it without bias, without judgment, we have the opportunity today to do that because we are in dialogue. So anyway, so I do have to go, but thank you very much, Stephanie, and especially Marcie for your wonderful discourse.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think Carmen.
Yes, thank you. Well, as you know, I am in South America, in Uruguay, and from my country, I have thanked you both, Marcie and Stephanie, and I have wrote on the chat what I feel. What I have met in these times of working for the real role of women in the future synod is that only through women we will be able to bring the peripheries to the church, as Pope Francis has called us for, because all this sensibility of women going to the tomb and not caring about any danger or whatever is what we need, the bravery we need to really have a church that cares about the excluded. I think that the women will be the key to this, because I am very concerned about our church not being able of including the peripheries, not only the economic peripheries, but also the existential peripheries. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carmen. Are there any more questions, thoughts that you'd like to share? Yes, Marcie.
Okay, I would just, I really appreciate that Stephanie focused us on the fear issue and appreciating how much we are afraid, that not only were they afraid, but we are, and that it's natural to be afraid, and how much help we need, right, from God, from each other, to keep moving forward, to go and be faithful, right, to do what we know we need to do, whatever that is in each of our lives. But how much it takes to get past that fear, it's always there. It really is always there. And I just, yeah. So I wanted to just lift that up again. And thanks, Stephanie, for pointing to it.
I would just say, when I was spending some time, I guess, really reflecting on that moment, I understood that if Jesus had been there, it also would have been terrifying. The moment was inherently terrifying, you know? And so Jesus not being there brought a new kind of fear. But the moment was the moment of seeing your friend and teacher publicly executed is just inherently traumatic, you know? And I think it's something that we can get used to. When we get used to it, we don't recognize the bravery of those women, not just being collapsed or trying to forget or trying to avoid, or to really go forward. It's something extraordinary. It's really something extraordinary.
I don't have a special thought to share, but I just want to thank both of you for the beauty, because I found simply that it was, in a way, what you shared, there was something of the beauty and of the grace also. And yeah, so I just wanted to thank you for what you shared and what you expressed also of this mystery of the resurrection that we are continually discovering. And maybe the place that we have to, as you said, Stephanie, that it was our place. We are not discovering, but each one of us as a Christian, we are still discovering in a way the way of welcoming that more and more in our lives. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much for both of you. Marcie for talk, Stephanie for your spiritual reflection. That brings us to the end of our second session. Thank you for both of the presenters today. Next week, Father David Neuhaus will be talking about the Pentecost on Mount Sinai and the Pentecost in Christian scriptures. So thank you for all those who tuned in this week. See you next week, same day, same time. God bless.
Bye.
Bye-bye.